Hello, my lovely students. So today, you're going to have two videos from me. One will be on analysis of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And then the next thing that we're going to talk about is we are going to talk about biblical poetry. And I don't know if you guys remember this about me or know this about me. I don't know if we've ever talked about it, but my degree is actually in comparative religious studies. And so I'm going to try not to geek out on you too hard here, but I make no promises. Okay, so when it comes to the Old Testament, right, we've got three different sections in terms of Jewish writing. So we've got the Torah, right, that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then we've got the Nevi'im, which is the prophets. And then we've got the Ketuvim, or the writings, and that's where the poetry component is found. There are prophets that speak in poems occasionally. There's even one prophet that does like a whole sarcastic funeral dirge, which is amazing, and I love it. But what we're really going to be talking about here in terms of biblical poetry are Psalms, Proverbs, and Job are really the heavy poetry books, okay? And then there's also contained in this writings, in this Ketuvim section, there's also these 5 scrolls, or the Hamish Megillot. And my Hebrew is not fantastic spoken, but that's going to be Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, the Book of Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And that's this whole section. And now some of these books do not contain poetry, some do. And what's interesting is, so when we're looking at poetry that happened in another language initially, we don't always get it. And a lot of that has to do with our translation. Okay, so your Bible translation has a lot to do with whether you consider something poetry or not, because it's not in your native tongue. So for example, when we look at the book of Ecclesiastes, the NIV, I wrote it down so I wouldn't get it wrong. The NIV considers 60% of the book of Ecclesiastes to be poetry. The NSRV considers 25% of it to be poetry. And the Revised English Bible only considers Ecclesiastes 3, 2 through 8 to be poetry. So there's a big difference there. And one of the things is it's translated. And one of the things is that sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between poetry and prose. Sometimes it's hard to tell if someone is... Remember the difference, the big difference between prose and poetry is that poetry is words as art, as an expression of art. And prose is words for kind of disseminating information or making a statement. And so especially when you're taking things out of, ancient Hebraic texts and turning them into modern English, it can be difficult to know. But let's just jump right in and let's talk about Ecclesiastes for a second. So with these books, most of them would have been available to the Hebrews that had gone through the exile. So if you remember, Israel gets broken into 2 kingdoms. So we've got Israel and we've got Judah. And both Israel and Judah go into exile. So Israel is taken over by the Assyrians, and Judah goes into the Babylonian captivity. So that's where we see Daniel and all of that happening. And then eventually this remnant gets to return back to Israel. And it's this remnant, this post-exilic period, where they would have had this as part of their canon. And canon, so our canon includes the 66 books of the Old and New Testament, and they were put together, and it was decided upon that these were the books that were going to comprise our canon. There are other books that exist that we chose not to add. So, for example, when I was graduating from school, there was the Gospel of Judas was found, and not the whole thing. But it doesn't line up with what we believe as a church. It doesn't line up with what the Old Testament and New Testament teach. And so that is not part of our canon. It's just an interesting piece of New Testament era writing that we found. And so it's not part of canon, but it exists. So canon is the books that are considered to be authoritative. They're the books that are considered to be divinely inspired. So that's what all of that is. So these people coming back from the exile will be able to look at all of these things and use them for encouragement as they're, dealing with kind of the turmoil and the difficulties in their lives. So Ecclesiastes is an interesting book. It can be a little depressing at times. And so one interesting thing is there's different names for God throughout the Old Testament. So there's this, the Tetragrammaton it's called, because it's 4 letters. We actually don't know how it would be said. It's usually said Yahweh by people today, but we don't actually know if that's the correct pronunciation. But this is the familiar Hebrew name for God that is considered so glorious and powerful that you don't necessarily say it or write it in places that are not holy or sacred. Then there's the more general, like Elohim, like Lord God kind of a thing. And that's the only version of God that we find in Ecclesiastes. Just a little interesting note. It's typically attributed to David's son Solomon. We're not really sure if he wrote it, but in Jewish tradition, they believe that Solomon wrote it. And whether or not that's true, whoever the writer of Ecclesiastes is, their themes are things like cynicism, like the futility of human effort. There's this overarching melancholy feeling to the whole thing, the cyclical nature of history. Usually when we think of Judeo-Christian tradition, time starts at one point and goes to an end, and in this it's very cyclical in nature, which we associate more with like Hinduism or Buddhism or something where there's a cyclical nature to history, and just the impermanence of everything. We had nothing by our efforts. There's like, as wisdom grows, vexation grows, and ultimately death removes everything. It's like, it's a real downer. But the reason I want to talk about Ecclesiastes is because there are some very famous verses from Ecclesiastes that I think you will recognize when we take a look at them. So I'm reading off my screen. I hope my face doesn't look too weird as I'm reading off the Bible on my screen. But Ecclesiastes 3. There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So that is the one section of verses that the Revised English Bible says is poetry, but you guys probably know it from other things. There's a famous, I'm going to get it wrong, hold on. There is a famous song. It's by the Byrds. I was going to say Beatles, but I knew that was wrong. So there's a famous song by the Byrds, and I'll put a link to it, that is this set of verses from Ecclesiastes. And when we get further into the book, there are a couple of verses that basically say, like, if there's nothing else, if this life is all we get, and, the wicked and the good both come to the same end, which is ultimately death, then we can still find happiness in whatever it is within our power to do, and that any joy we find in 3:13, any joy that we find is from God. And when we get to chapter 12, 11 through 13, some people think this was added by another author as kind of a postscript, and some think that it's from the original author. But basically, it says that at the end, even though life is temporary, we do well to follow God and keep his commandments. But anyway, the big thing for me was talking about that 3:2 through 8, because I think that is a great example of how biblical poetry, and really so much of the Bible, when you really know scripture and you've really read it and put it in your mind and put it in your heart as you're going through and you're listening to great speeches from history, when you're looking in, even in great works of literature where they repeat themes and sayings and names from the Bible, the allusions that happen in Western, art, literature, music from scripture are incredible. So I just wanted to start with Ecclesiastes. So next, we're going to go into Psalms. And Psalms is an anthology, just like you guys are making. It is a collection of lyric poetry. Most of the poems are prayers to God. And in being completely honest with you guys, so in Jane Eyre, which is a very famous book, Jane is an orphan, and she's been called in by this overseer of the school who wants to judge her piety. And he asks her if she reads scripture. And she tells him, well, I do, but, there's certain books that I like better than others. And so she really likes the prophetic books. Like, she likes Revelation, she likes Daniel, and then after that, she likes the narrative, like, exciting books, so, like, parts of Kings, parts of Chronicles. And he says, well, what about the Psalms? And she goes, not really. I don't find them that interesting. And when I read that, despite the fact that Jane is in a very bad situation when she's saying this, I laughed so hard, because that's kind of how I've always felt about the Psalms. But there are a lot of people that find the Psalms to be very encouraging and read a psalm every day. And so if that is you, I think that is fantastic, and you should do that. So there's 150 psalms, and religious tradition, especially in Judaism, is that David wrote the Psalms. And David is a great musician. We know that, and we know he danced before the Lord. But only 73 of the 150 are attributed as being a psalm of David, and some of them actually have other attributions. So the word psalm comes from psalmoi in the Greek, because originally the Old Testament was translated into what we call the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament. And so the Greek word references religious songs that were played along with a specific musical instrument, and the name of the musical instrument is where we get psalmoi from. And in Hebrew, it's called Tehillim, and that means praises. It just means praises. So they're praises to God. So some of the songs are even attributed to, like, temple leadership and would have been used potentially in worship. Some of them are songs that were written for royal use, maybe for a coronation or a royal wedding or something like that. Some of them have words in them, like Selah, that are musical terms that we don't necessarily know what it means. They're technical terms, and they indicate to us maybe, like, the meter of the song, or what you would do at a certain place, or maybe it's a repetition. We don't know. And the book of Psalms is broken into 5 parts. So the first part, and what's really cool about this, is these parts have to do with prepositions of God, okay? So this is a great little English moment for me. So the 5 books have to do with the location of God in conjunction with us. So section 1 is 1 through 41. Those psalms are all of David's psalms, and they're God beside us. And then the second section is 42 to 72. And 72 actually ends with the prayers of David are ended. So that's really the portion that we know of belonging to David, and that's where it ends. And that's God before us, God going ahead of us, God engaging with our enemies before we even get there. And then 3 is 73 to 89, and that's God around us. 4 is 90 to 106, and that's God above us. And then 107 to 150 is God with us. And so again, we've got beside, before, around, above, and with, or among. And so that's a really cool thing about the Psalms. And when it comes to Psalms, there are a lot of people that find a lot of comfort in the Psalms. A lot of people that feel that the Psalms really speak to them about God's presence in their life and all of that. And so I would like for you guys to take a moment to try a psalm. And, you know, our psalms are probably not going to rise to the level of biblical psalms. And they might not have the same level of revelation that like David would have had coming from his relationship with God, but that doesn't mean that they can't be a form of worship or a form of poetry that is accessible to us. And so I think that if you're going to try this, I found a retreat that did it, and they had some rules. So I'm going to read you their rules because I think their rules will be very helpful for you in feeling like you can do this. So rule 1, write your psalm from the standpoint of faith, trusting God no matter what. 2, try to write in poetic form, not prose, verse form, not paragraph. Write with candor and honesty. The psalmists teach us that pain and struggle can be freely expressed to God. Allow your feelings and emotions to show through because faith is more than knowledge and facts. Try to use figurative speech, including metaphors and similes like the psalmists use. Write reflectively after sorting through your own experiences. And write as New Testament Christians because we know that the Messiah has already come. So there's no reason for you to predict the coming Messiah or the coming of Jesus or the forgiveness of sins because we know those things already exist. So this would be kind of a New Testament psalm, something that's written from the perspective of a Christ follower. Okay? So the example that I have from this is called Cafe Cantate Domino, and it's a coffee psalm. And they actually wrote it in the shape of a coffee cup. And if you are watching this right now, I would love for you to go to the Google Classroom and tell me what we call a poem written in a particular shape. And I will take a picture of this and put it on the Google Classroom as well so you can see it. So, a coffee psalm. Oh God, you are like coffee. You percolate, and the mere sound of you stirs me from sleep. I thirst for you, O God, in the morning when I wake up. Your aroma permeates my soul when I come into your presence. You pour yourself out and shower me with blessings. You fill my cup with good things. Your heat and steam rise as incense and fill my nostrils. I lift you up with my hands and drink you into my being. Your warmth penetrates my mouth. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Your warmth continues to travel through me, warming my gut. You dwell ever within me. You energize me, O God. After a time, you give me energy to set about the tasks you lay before me. I return to you, O God, throughout the day and get renewed and refreshed every time I drink you in. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. You restore my soul and fill my senses. You help me get through the day when my sleepiness tries to keep me from doing your will. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Oh God, you are like coffee to me. So, that's an example. I don't think that you could try to write one of those without reading a couple of Psalms, and I don't have particular ones. I mean, obviously the 23rd Psalm, very famous. But pick a couple of Psalms at random. Just through all 5 sections. Pick one from each of the 5 sections that we talked about and read them, because you'll see things like they repeated, taste and see that the Lord is good. Many Psalms have kind of a, almost a chorus that happens in them. And so that would not be uncommon. See the language that David uses in his Psalms and see how he speaks to God through his poetry. This doesn't have to be one of the ones that you use necessarily, but I'd really like for you to try it. And if you feel comfortable sharing it or putting in your anthology, I think that would be great. So the last thing that I want to go into really quickly is the Song of Solomon. And the Song of Solomon is kind of an extended lyrical poem, or I guess it's more appropriate to say that it is a series of lyrical poems. It's also called the Song of Psalms, Song of Songs. Did I say Song of Psalms? I'm really sorry if I did. Song of Songs, like the best song ever written. And it's a collection of lyrical poems that are arranged in a way that it is a conversation between a woman and her lover. And so this one. So there are some scholars that say that the Song of Solomon is an extended metaphor for the love of God and the church. And we see that in the New Testament, where we see Christ and his bride, the church. There are some people that think this is just a typical poem you would have seen at the time in the Middle East, talking about, a celebration of virility and fertility and human love between two humans. But regardless of what you think it is a beautiful poem. And when you read it, it's a little weird for us. There are some metaphors that don't make sense to us. Like, I compare you, my love, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariots. Helpful hint, guys. I'm talking to all of you. If you go up to a girl today and you tell her that you're comparing her to a mare, she ain't gonna like that very much. Don't do that. Some of this stuff does not translate well across the centuries and across, the linguistic differences. But parts of it are very beautiful and very famous. And so Mr. Cutlass and I, when we got married, had a ketubah, which is a traditional Jewish marriage contract. And our ketubah and the words that we said during our marriage, a lot of them come from the Song of Solomon, and they're very famous in terms of love poetry and of expressing emotion between husbands and wives and humans in terms of love. So, are there other poetry things with the Bible I want to talk about? I don't think so. I think that's it. I think that's all I want to do. Now, again, when we look at the Bible as literature, it can sometimes be different than when we look at it from the perspective of like a Sunday school class. And so, for example, when I tell you some scholars think that this is different authors, if your church or your parents teach that David wrote every one of the Psalms, you should go with that. But when we talk about it from a scholastic perspective, and we're talking about it as literature that we're analyzing, sometimes there are different people that have different beliefs from a scholarly perspective than they would from a religious perspective necessarily. So if any of this offends your sensibilities, you just belay it and don't worry about it. But yes, all of this divine poetry that we see in the Bible is beautiful in its expression of love to God, and I really want you guys to try some of it, and I hope that you'll consider including some of it in your anthology. If you're going to pick a psalm, pick a psalm. If you would like to include something from Ecclesiastes or from Job or from the Song of Solomon, you're going to want to probably pick a section because those books are a little bit longer. And one thing that I really recommend you do is kind of look at the commentary that's out there. Your parents can probably recommend a Bible commentary that they like to use, but if they can't, I'm happy to recommend one that I use. But just look at the commentary, make sure you understand what the psalm is about, make sure that you understand what's really being said, and where there might be symbolism or allusion to other parts of the Bible. Right now, I'm reading Isaiah with one of my friends, and as we're going through, one of the things that I'm doing is trying to mark every time that I see a verse that's later in the New Testament. And so you can gain a lot of perspective when you read an Old Testament passage with an eye towards Jesus and how he fulfills it. So that's a really fun thing to do too. I don't want this to turn into a Sunday school lesson because I'm not here to teach you theology. It's just I wanted to make sure that I included biblical poetry as one of our examples because I think it's beautiful, and I think that using your skill set as an expression of devotion to God is really important. So if you are a writer and you like to write, I think that using that gift and talent to glorify God is great. So I think that's everything, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I will post some more poems daily for you to read just to kind of give you a breadth and depth of different kinds of poetry that are out there, and I hope that you guys enjoy your week. All right, see you soon.